Thank you so much, Volker, for this invite, and I'm glad to be in Berlin in spirit. With Weizenbaum was a great place for me to have spent some time working on my book and some other projects. And then like a few months ago in July, we had this amazing workshop that was really, really helpful for my own projects, and the conversation was really wonderful. So I'm looking forward to today's discussion as well. So, as Volker mentioned, this paper is part of a larger work that I've been doing since 2015, which is crazy when you say it out loud. It's like a decade's worth of research on looking at like how technology companies try to make interventions in urban spaces, particularly focusing on the United States, but through collaborations, I was able to also do some comparative work. And I'm mostly in general interested in how the presence of tech companies, either through platforms or like smart cities, smart infrastructures, how that reshapes local governance and politics. So the book is covering a larger ground, but in this particular paper, that was part of a special issue that I also co-edited. We wanted to spotlight Google in particular. So my collaborator, Dr. Antoine Courmand, hosted this workshop 2 years ago at Sciences Po, where we gathered together to discuss Google's and I must say Alphabet's, and I'm going to talk about that distinction a little bit later, how the company's territorial strategies converged with its sort of technical capacity to digitize and calculate cities, like its residents, its land, its housing stock, its urban infrastructures. And we wanted to understand like what that does to local governance across very different examples. So we have papers from Mexico to Chile, Switzerland, Germany, France, the US. We're trying to sort of understand whether we talk about platform urbanism or smart cities, how does the presence of a company like Google change the way that municipalities do their sort of day-to-day governance, residents and local businesses react to those changes? And it's interesting to focus on Google in this respect because, I'm from a media studies and political economy background. And when it comes to platform urbanism and smart cities, there's a lot of focus on companies like Airbnb or Uber and how they sort of restructured like sort of property markets or urban transportation. But strangely, Google and Alphabet have been relatively less examined. There's some notable exceptions like the Sidewalk Labs project in Toronto, or maybe I should say for this particular audience, like Google's headquarters project in Berlin. They got some attention from scholars and popular media. But beyond that, we don't know enough about what Google's been doing on the ground. And I want to sort of illustrate that a little bit before I get into the details of my paper. So this is a very simple slide that Antoine put together, just looking at like what portion of Alphabet's revenue over the years comes from advertising versus other sort of ventures. And as you can see, in 2010s, the company starts shifting a little bit away from advertising and adds another layer of revenues. And when you unpack that, you see a lot of different examples, like, especially in relation to cities. So Google Maps, I guess, is the most well-known example, which is actually celebrating its 20th year anniversary this year. The company bought Waze in 2013. It has experimented with telecom networks like Google Fiber that I'm going to talk about, Google Wi-Fi, Google Station, its satellite network. Since 2011, Google Arts and Culture has worked with cities, museums, cultural institutions to digitize cultural heritage. I have to say, especially again for this community, Google Maps, for example, is not just a navigation tool. It's a reputation management platform for local businesses. And Antoine in the Courmand in the special issue has a great paper about that I highly recommend, like how Google Maps and its own reputational sort of curation, algorithmic curation, affects local businesses and their success in French cities. And then there's also all kinds of like different investment arms like Google Ventures. And through that, like Google has a stake in companies like Uber, Lime, energy companies like Nest, real estate companies like Nextdoor, Waymo, autonomous vehicles, Wing, drone delivery. There's also this, again, this is a case from Germany through Google's Environmental Insights Explorer. The company collaborates with municipalities to track their sort of carbon offsetting sustainability strategies. So there's a lot that Google's doing in cities that we do not pay enough attention to. And one of the goals for this special issue was to make this more visible. And through that, our goal was not to craft a narrative of Google as this like supersized, overwhelmingly significant actor. On the contrary, we focused on the ways the company fails, or at least sort of stalls or gets negotiated among different stakeholders in cities like policymakers, planning experts, residents. And conceptually, we also distinguish Google from other urban tech companies like Uber or Airbnb because this is a massive, like, company, a member of big tech. So it has that sort of economic, political, and symbolic weight. But it's also an incredibly agile company when it comes to its platform capabilities. So it brings a lot of innovation in the space of like how to extract data from urban environments, how to monetize urban data. So throughout these like different case studies, our goal was to show this fragmented, negotiated, and resisted forms of Google's urban presence. And we kind of challenged the idea of a universal, uniform digital capitalism. And we kind of put the focus on how uneven and situated tech power is in cities through using Google as an example. All right, so my own paper, as the title explains, tries to sort of define this idea of Google urbanism within a particular time frame between 2010 to 2020. And I look closely at two of the company's experimental and openly city-centric projects, Google Fiber and Sidewalk Labs. In line with my larger work, like I choose these projects because these are part of Google's testbed initiatives. So they are not like they didn't start off as like sort of long-term projects at the start. They were presented as trials. So there was a lot of error. They were very speculative from the very beginning. They were very disruptive from the very beginning, and I'm going to get into the details in a second. And they were launched at a time when this sort of moment of smart and platform urbanism was very much in vogue, unlike the current moment, which is all about AI. The past decade did not have as much on AI, but more on like smart infrastructures, platform capabilities, and Google really tried to take advantage of that moment. So I kind of wanted to show that in this paper. And then I wanted to sort of compare and contrast these two initiatives because when you look at them closely, their business models, field operations, and the way that they work with local governments are very different, even though they're part of the same company. So it allows us to have a closer look into the larger strategies of a bigger company and allows us to ask this question of like, is there a cohesive strategy behind all of this? Or these are really more like sort of speculative short-term projects. So Google Fiber was announced in 2010 with a nationwide competition. It's Google's gigabit internet network. So it's a broadband network. Like there's, I have to say, there's not much sort of sexiness about this project. If you look at it like from a technical perspective, it was really Google telling American telecom companies in 2011, 2010 that they don't know how to build the next generation of the internet. Like you're slow, you're costly, and you can't keep up with my software company's capabilities was kind of like Google's dare when it was launched. And they wanted to show to establish telecom companies that there was a more cost-efficient way of building sort of telecom networks and building faster, like much faster internet in order to keep up with what they consider to be the next generation of like Silicon Valley. When it was launched, there was this like major nationwide competition. More than 1,000 American cities applied to be the first Google Fiber city because Google said, like, I'm going to launch this competition, and whomever gets selected, we're going to start testing fiber in their city. And there are some, I don't think I talk about this enough in the paper, but in my book, I talk about like all these sort of PR stunts like cities got into in order to attract Google's attention, and they wanted to be picked by Google. And after this sort of big competition, it was Kansas City in the Midwest America that was selected. And that's where I spent 3 years to do the field work that, later became my book. So that's sort of part of my information data about Google Fiber comes from. So when you look at sort of Google and Kansas City's relationship as a local government, first of all, what you see is that this is not a traditional public-private partnership. Google is the sole owner of the broadband network, coming into cities, testing different business models, but they sign an agreement with the city because they need like access to land, they need access to like city resources. And then when you look at closely to the contract, you see that this sort of collaboration between two partners, even though it is not a traditional public-private partnership, goes much deeper than more sort of well-known examples of collaborations between companies and cities. Google has near free access to all city assets and infrastructures according to the contract. Whenever they apply for a permit application, those applications must be approved within 5 working days, which is very like unusual for local government processes. They have an executive sponsor at the highest municipal level, in which case this was the assistant city manager, like number 2 in the mayor's office, to be responsible for handling Google's sort of internal sort of operations. So this is a very close, very intimate, and even though the city is not providing any monetary subsidies, they were allocating a lot of serious resources to this operation. But at the same time, you have to remember that in 2010-11, Google was still primarily a software company. So this is the first time this company is going to the built environment, working with these like on the ground crews. They really don't know how to communicate with publics. Like Google is notoriously secretive. So there are these like really long stretches of silence from the company. They dig up the streets and then leave them open for days, which, as you can imagine, like creates a lot of complaints from residents. The way that they roll out the network throughout the city is never sort of communicated ahead of time. So it comes off as a surprise to like neighbors. And whenever these sort of local problems emerge, it's not Google that's the face of these operations. It's always the municipal, like the mayor's office that has to respond to that, which again, like shows you how the relationship between the company and the local government was very non-traditional, right? Like when it's never Google's fault on paper, and every time the city government was like intervening to cover up for them. They were also really struggling to hold the company accountable whenever there were delays or problems, or enforce compliance with local regulations. This has been documented in Kansas City and all the other cities where Google Fiber was rolled out. So in the end, the way that I kind of characterize Google Fiber is this moment when Google was really using its like big tech status, both symbolically and sort of infrastructurally, to exert itself in the local politics of a city. And here I want to give a shout out to this special issue in Science as Culture by Keen Birch and Kelly Brownson, titled Big Tech, because they really conceptualize like how this big tech operates compared to other tech companies. And one of the things they talk about is how this, like, in addition to setting industry standards, having decisions that have like far-reaching impact, and this sort of scale that is like really important and specific to big tech companies, companies like Amazon, Google, Meta, Apple, they also have this sort of symbolic weight, right? Like every startup wants to be absorbed into them. Every sort of city wants to work with them. There's this sort of branding effect that we cannot deny. And with Google Fiber, we see how Google was like really milking this and using it to both cover the city from an infrastructural perspective and to pull that weight into its relationship with local governments. And I'm happy to elaborate on all this in the Q&A. So let me move on to Sidewalk Labs. So Sidewalk Labs was launched in 2015 as the sort of urban innovation arm of Alphabet. At that point, Google was like more backstage, and it was Alphabet as the parent company that was being sort of advertised. And they had this like team of architects, planners, technologists, and the idea was to rethink infrastructure, but like in a smaller scale with digital tech like sort of layered onto them. One of the well-known, like I think everyone talks about Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, which I'm happy to talk about, but in this paper, I actually intentionally don't get into it. And instead, I focus on all the other projects Sidewalk Labs did. And I think all these other projects were more telling about what the company wanted to do. So one of these was these Link NYC kiosks that you see on the screen. This happened in New York City, where Sidewalk Labs with a bunch of other companies turned New York City's old payphone system network into these digital kiosks that offer free public Wi-Fi, phone calls, web browsing, and mobile charging stations. The interesting thing about like Link NYC though is that it had this sort of urban data collection capacity. So all these kiosks had sensors that tracked like mobility around neighborhoods. Whenever people connected to public Wi-Fi, obviously they collected that data. So they were able to have this like location-based advertising on the screens that were supposed to be very dynamic and adaptive. And they also wanted to like track foot traffic for local businesses and sell that data to like sort of shops in specific neighborhoods. And then they also, because they were doing a lot of advertising on these kiosks, they were able to share the revenue with the city of New York, which is a very different model, right? Like a more traditional public-private partnership where they are sort of collecting some revenue from the city's operations and then sharing that as opposed to the fiber model where they were like separate entities and there was an actual money exchange. So this was a much more sort of data-driven, platform-driven, and advertising-driven project. So that's sort of like number one. Number two, that Sidewalk Labs was also like very much like an incubator. The company created a lot of smaller startups, like either found them already existing out across the US and incorporated them into their operations, or sort of in-house invested in them. So they had this company called Replica, which was an urban planning software. There was another company that focused on smart grids. There was Delve, which was like a generative urban design tool. And you can see like this is in 2017, 2018, the company was slowly moving into the AI space. They had this company called like startup called CityBlock, targeting personalized healthcare for low-income communities. So some of these initiatives were like incubated within Sidewalk Labs and then became these independent spin-offs. And then others were like acquired by different companies, again, within Google Ventures system. But the sort of, I don't want to call it business model because they were like startups, but the way that they marketed or rolled out their products was, again, very similar to how Google Fiber operated. So they used to go up to municipalities and demonstrate like a prototype or a proof of concept and give them like a few months of trial and like work with these tools. And then after the city governments, city agencies like got used to these tools, like then they would sort of turn into the subscription-based model of allowing them to use these platforms. And again, like using local government agencies not necessarily as primary partners, but as clients, basically. So it's like a very much like Airbnb, Uber type of a model, like giving their data away to municipal agencies type of a partnership than what happened with Link NYC or even Google Fiber. And this is also the first time we're seeing Google experimenting with this idea of like helping municipal governments with data analytics. And as I mentioned before, like pushing them into this sort of generative AI, predictive analytics space, different than what they were doing with Fiber or Link NYC. So to distinguish Sidewalk Labs from Fiber, I argue that they were less focused on the infrastructural control and more on programmability. And here, again, another sort of shout out to this amazing paper in New Media and Society by Jean-Christophe Plantin and his colleagues, where they kind of look at big tech companies between their infrastructural control status and their programmability capacity is. So in Sidewalk Labs, there's much less emphasis on we can build this for you and more emphasis on we have all these data analytics tools as Google, and all these like startup spin-offs are going to be powered by us, supported by us. So let them test their products. But we don't see the Google branding as much. We see a very strategic obscuring of the Google branding, and that's partly a reaction to all the sort of bad PR Google Fiber received when they were doing this sort of infrastructure project in other cities. And if you think about it from a city perspective, the idea of working with Google's code and tools is very appealing, especially if the municipalities don't have enough people, don't have enough resources to do data analytics. So it gives them a very straightforward way to be data-driven and have a young, agile startup to work with them. But when you look at the relationship, as I mentioned before, there is this like much more traditional model of here are the revenues we're going to generate. Here's how we're going to split them. Throughout this project, I actually used Freedom of Information Act requests to get the contracts and the corporate presentations of these startups to municipal agencies. And there's all this emphasis on not just like revenue sharing, but actually asking cities to like reroute some of their subsidies into these startups. So for example, this company called Flow, which was an urban transit planning startup tool, literally in their contract, like they are asking if you have any urban public transportation subsidies, like we want a portion of that in order to give our products to you. So there's this like much more emphasis on a tech company coming in and wanting to take away public resources model, much more explicit and much more pronounced in the contract level in a way that was more relational in Google Fiber. So after comparing and contrasting these two projects within the same time frame, I kind of argue that we need to look at Google's political economic power in cities through this dual capacity of platform modularity, which we see through Sidewalk Labs, and infrastructural power as a member of big tech. Whenever it's in its interest, the company spotlights its data-centric and flexible programmability and launches these like experimental speculative projects. And municipalities are very eager to let Google come into their offices and streamline their decision-making processes with these like advanced analytical products. But in the process, Google is taking away their data, obviously, taking away their existing internal resources. And as we see with the Sidewalk Labs project, they are eager to also take away like actual economic resources, monetary resources like public revenues and subsidies. Um, and of course, I can elaborate this in the Q&A, when this is all happening, there is usually not much pushback, mainly because, these are happening at the municipal level, and this is not necessarily like covered by the news or anything most of the time. Like it's very behind the scenes. So there's not like much intentional secrecy, but there's not an effort to also be transparent about this. This test bed model obviously also allows the company to deflect public scrutiny, because if there are failures, they're part of experimenting, right? Like, so they're not like big, massive scandals necessarily, although there were some moments when those became a scandal. And I think the most well-known failure is the Toronto project, which also led to the demise of Sidewalk Labs, which I'm happy to elaborate on. But in the end, like most of the time, Google's partnership with these cities, whether it's like explicitly named Google or not, like are framed not as intrusions, but as gifts. So opportunities to access tools that they could not afford otherwise. Like one of the, to me at least, like outrageous examples of that is Google's Environmental Insights Explorer in German cities, where the company literally comes in and offers its like free platform. But in the paper that we published, the authors talk about like most of the time, municipal staff is doing the very basic labor of data cleaning, data entry for Google, not necessarily using Google's capabilities to make improvements in the city. So there is that like sort of uneven relationship. And to the question that I posed at the start of this paper, is there a coherent strategy behind Google's experimental urban tech initiatives? My answer was a limited no. It's a limited answer because throughout all this research, which, as I said, took a decade, I never was able to talk to any Google employee, executive on the record. Like I've had many off the record conversations, but there was never an on the record conversation that could help me make sense of Google's strategy, if there was a coherence behind it or not. So from the outside, it looks pretty fragmented. It looks pretty ad hoc, very much adaptive to local political economic context rather than the company coming in and pushing for a stubborn agenda. But that lack of coherence is not necessarily a weakness, I found. It's actually a strength because it makes Google's presence in cities really harder to pin down. It makes it harder for us as researchers, as journalists, to track what the company has been doing because it's so like sort of distributed and decentralized and all over the place. And this testing framing also makes it hard to access the formal contracts. And then overall, it makes it really less susceptible to regulation and public scrutiny. So let me just stop here as I'm hitting the 30-minute mark, and we can move on to a more open discussion and a Q&A.